Hi, and welcome to Diversity and Inclusion in Small Business, presented by the ASBAS Digital Solutions Program from Business Station, Treaty Business Consulting, and Regional Development Australia, Brisbane. My name is Dante St James. I'll be taking you through today's session, and it's going to be a very interesting one because it's not something that everybody's often really thought about in a great deal of depth. But if we look at a quote here from Soichiro Honda saying, if you only hire only those people you understand, the company will never get people better than you are already. Always remember that you often find outstanding people amongst those you don't understand or even particularly like. Very wise words from a man who built a giant multinational, transnational company, I guess. We all know exactly who Honda is. This is brought to you by Business Station and the Australian Small Business Advisory Services Digital Solutions Program, brought to you also by Regional Development Australia, Brisbane in Queensland, and in the Northern Territory by Treaty Business Consulting. This will be available on YouTube under the Business Station channel. I do encourage you that if you have turned up late for this one, or if you want to watch this again, this is where you'll do it in just a couple of days' time. What we're going to cover in this session is what inclusion is and what it's not, how modern business building and marketing tends to play to the majority, how to bring diversity and inclusion into your marketing, and diversity thinking when it comes to how you communicate in your business. My name is Dante St James. I've got a lot of certifications there, more recently having been involved in the Darwin Pride Festival as a marketing consultant for them, amongst many other areas, including the Stay Smart Online and Be Connected Australian government programs, which are very much geared towards older Australians who are a bit more vulnerable when it comes to problems with the digital world, I guess. And also very recently, the new business assistance with the new enterprise incentive scheme with the Australian government. So first, we'll take a look at what inclusion actually is and a little bit about what it isn't. Inclusion is not about quotas necessarily. It's not about putting token people in place. It's also not about necessarily ignoring merit or what you might call the best person for the job. What inclusion is more about is recognizing that we are naturally biased. It's almost built into us that we tend to be very biased towards certain outcomes, certain preferences, and certain things that we'll include into our business. Inclusion is about recognizing that this particular bias that we have is quite bad for business. And then it's also about us very consciously moving beyond that bias and towards a business that does include, that does have some idea of diversity behind it, even if it doesn't feel that way now, that it will in the future. So I did say there that diversity is bad for business. And why is diversity, lack of it, bad for business? Well, a lack of diversity means a lack of diversity of ideas in your business. If you're the only person making decisions about your business and contributing to the conversation about your business, then you're in a really dangerous place because you are limited as a person. Your background is limited. The experiences you've gone through in life are quite limited. There are things that you will go through in your life that others don't go through, but there's things that others will go through in their lives that they could bring as ideas to your business without some sort of diversity or some sort of inclusion of people other than yourself. And we're not even talking about any of the kinds of diversity in there, just other people for now. You're going to miss out on those ideas. A lack of diversity also means that there's a lack of opinion being expressed in a workplace, in a business. And that comes through as when you've got a lot of people who are what we call yes men or yes people. The ability to get different kinds of opinions in when it comes to any particular subject matter or topic, so that you are ensuring that there's going to be a lot more than just the average response, just the response which is the one that we expect everybody to give because we're all from the same place, the same town, the same background. The idea of getting a diversity of opinion is that you get some people who bring their very unique backgrounds to the conversation so they can contribute to the opinions that you will have. And ultimately, the decisions you're going to make about your business. Now, a lack of diversity in marketing is bad for business. And I'm going to go into that in a lot more detail a little bit further into this particular presentation. But what we're talking about here is the fact that if you have a lack of diversity in your marketing, you have a lack of reach to people other than the people you generally reach for, which are generally people who are going to look and feel a lot like you do. So how do we measure diversity in a small business? Well, we'll go through some of the areas where diversity comes into play. Some of these may be under gender. The bias that a lot of businesses, particularly small businesses, may express towards one gender or another, or someone who is non-binary. We'll start off with the idea that there's often a lot of effort put towards getting and maintaining male workers in a workplace. A small business that aims particularly for men to do things misses out on a whole lot of the additional experience that others may have, whether that's a man, someone who's gender non-specific, or what they call gender fluid. When it comes to your marketing, not expressing something that appeals to people of another gender other than your usual one you go for, or even for somebody who expresses no gender or is even transgender, is bad for business, because these people do exist. They are part of your market as well. Now, they may not be part of your, when we're doing our highly targeted marketing campaigns and looking at how our business is aimed towards the world, we don't always necessarily go, well, I'm going to aim for transgendered people. But it's just a recognition that transgendered people, gender non-specific people, men, women, they all exist in the market and they all have money to spend. Race is probably the highest profile one of this last particularly year. There's been a lot said about race, a lack of inclusivity and diversity in a lot of tech companies. Places like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft have all been accused of not having a very diverse workforce. Now, that diversity could be based on gender, or in this case, in race as well. A lack of people of a Hispanic background or an African-American background in those American tech companies has been called into question. Now, how is that bad for business? In the case of the tech companies, they're writing algorithms that are recognizing faces. They're recognizing all kinds of things. A very well-publicized example of how a lack of diversity into the programming of these algorithms happened just 3 years ago, when Google Photos was given a significant upgrade where people will be recognized, but a new feature came in that recognized things like dogs and other common mammals and lizards. So you could take a photo of a lizard and it will actually tell you what that lizard was. Unfortunately, many photos of African-American men and women were tagged as being not even human. And the issue here is that not enough was put into the algorithm to help the facial recognition of people of darker skin tones. Now, that's bad for business, and Google certainly took a pounding over that. But think of it too, in terms of how you think about the information that's going into making your decisions. If that information is only based on a very small subset of people, and it's not expanding out to a far wider sample, then you're only getting part of the story. You're only getting part of the information of what's out there. When we think about diversity and inclusion, we think also of language. In Australia, yes, we do have a vast majority of people speak English as a first language at home, but there's another lot of people who don't. And when we produce something in English, we may be missing out on other markets. For instance, those who primarily speak Mandarin, Russian. They might speak German, French, Thai, or Tamil. By not producing some kind of option for people from those backgrounds, you're immediately locking them out. Now, in Australia, we do have a very, very high English literacy and numeracy. That means that it's very easy to write for people in English within Australia. But that's not counting the level of English proficiency that your readers may have. Using words like proficiency, for instance, is probably not a great example of making the language of your website or your marketing or your Facebook posts something that's accessible to the maximum amount of people, regardless of the level of their English proficiency. I'll use that word again. You're allowing people to easily read and understand and act upon the messages you're putting out there. In a marketing sense, that's about making it simple for as many people as possible to receive, interpret, and act upon your message. And you don't do that by using a word like proficiency. You do that by making it easy for people to read and act on, knowing there's a very clear call to action. You don't have to write something in every language on the planet. We do have Google Translate for that now. But Google Translate does have a difficult time translating lots of tech terms, colloquialisms, and in-talk or jargon that comes within certain industries or certain communities. So we keep that simple. We allow that to be so much more inclusive to people who speak primarily another language other than English. When it comes to religion, there's a vast array of religions in Australia. And whilst we might think that Christianity represents well over 60% of the religious affiliation that happens in Australia, we also recognize that there are many other religions here as well. So when you're claiming Bible verses as part of your marketing, even though that might make sense to someone who went through Sunday school as a kid, it's actually worth remembering the majority of Australian kids these days do not go through Sunday school. They're not going to know that story you're referring to. And it goes beyond this as well, of course. When you start to only receive the opinions and the input and the ideas from people from a specific religious background, you don't know quite when it is that you're offending someone from another one. And whilst we don't want to live in a world where we're constantly walking on eggshells and not wanting to offend anybody, that's certainly not the aim of this particular presentation. We do want to be aware that there are some things that others are sensitive to. Now, it doesn't mean we have to change everything about ourselves, editing yourself to become a different person other than the person you are. But having some sensitivity and a thought before you go in. And that's the main message you'll come across today. Having some thought before you go into full action on these particular topics. Next is the topic of sexual orientation. Now, this is where we only represent happy couples as being a man and a woman, or we only present, valid families as being headed by a man and a woman. It's often said that there's about 10% of the population sits somewhere on the Kinsey scale that's not exactly fully straight, that there is a lot of people who regard themselves as lesbian, gay. They might be bisexual, transgender, asexual, intersex. They sit on a very broad spectrum of areas of life, of lifestyles being expressed. Talking in terms of people saying what their sexual choices are or their lifestyle choices is insulting to somebody who really honestly from a very young age knew that they weren't the same as everybody else. So when we're using language, it's worth having a thought. We don't have to, again, edit yourself down to the most inoffensive and ineffective words you possibly can find. It's about being sensitive to who else is out there. Having a thought before you go and type that. Just having a read through and go, how would my gay cousin read this? How would my lesbian niece read this? And if you don't have any of those people, there's going to be someone in the office. There's going to be someone in your life who's from a different sexual orientation. You can always run this past. And trust me, they will actually welcome the opportunity to just give it a read over for you and let you know if there's something that you might just have missed. If you're not from those backgrounds, it's very hard, like in religion, like in gender, like in cultural expression. It's hard to have a full understanding of how things are read by people from different backgrounds because we tend to play to the majority every time. Moving on from sexual orientation to levels of education. Quite often we see this expressed in America more than many other places in the world, but we see this from our friends from India as well. where there's an expectation for someone to work in a call center, they have a communications degree or a master's level education in communications to answer the phones at a call center. Now that can be a lot to do with the competitive nature of the labor market in India. Or it could just be that it's known that we only hire people who go to University of Sydney, or that we only hire people who have completed a university education. Now, when you only hire people from specific levels of education, you're missing out on the expertise that comes from people who haven't had that specific area of education. When you hire someone who's only done vet courses, they don't understand necessarily the analysis and the statistical validity that goes into putting forth an argument and presenting it for a very high level of assessment, the same way that someone is doing a bachelor or a master's or an honors course at university. Likewise, someone who's been to university for a great period of their lives may not understand what it's like to go through the rough and tumble of a tech college or a TAFE or a vet course. When you limit yourself to one particular kind of education, you limit yourself to one particular set of ideas and opportunities. And remembering too, that when you hire people specifically for their level of education, you're not necessarily hiring the people that are best suited for who you're trying to communicate your message to. So we're not saying don't hire people with education or do hire people with education, just simply saying, have a think about these things, making sure that if you've got a room full of University of Sydney graduates, that you also have others who are not graduates of that particular university or of that particular course or of that particular level of education. It makes it a more balanced workforce. It makes it a more balanced discussion, and ideas will flow so much more freely when not everybody's reading from the same page. Another area where diversity can be often seen is in psychometrics. And psychometrics is where, for instance, you do those multiple choice answers when it comes to going into a job for the first time. Quite a lot of government and large corporates will do this. Some of these will be designed to learn what your learning style is. For instance, are you a visual, kinesthetic, or auditory learner? Do you learn better by being presented something up front and a picture? Do you learn better from hearing someone talk? Or do you learn better from somebody showing you what to do and then encouraging you to do it yourself? Psychometrics can also be in the form of the Myers-Briggs test, an INFP or an ESTJ, or one of those different varieties and expressions of personality and thinking styles. For instance, even though I work in quite an extroverted workplace, in a very extroverted kind of role, I am an introvert when it comes to the Myers-Briggs tests. Now, does that say anything about me? Well, what it probably says is that you may want a mixture of people who are introverted and extroverted throughout a workplace. Having everybody who's extroverted could be a bit too much. It could be it could be just a lot, okay? But then having too many introverts means that perhaps nobody's in a position where they really enjoy the process of sales. Having an input from an introvert for your graphic design, as opposed to from an extrovert, will mean that you'll tend to find that the introverted person may produce things that are a lot more demure, a lot more toned down. They'll express themselves into their work. The same occurs with copywriting. If you have a copywriter who is very extroverted, some of their writing may come across as a little bit aggressive. So having that balance of people coming in from different kinds of psychometric backgrounds can be very helpful to getting that balance you need to ensure that you're not leaving money on the table, or you're not leaving at least opportunities or styles of writing, expression, graphics, or design aside. Another very popular one is what's called the DISC profile. DISC stands for dominant, influence, support, I think it is, and I want to say compliance, but it's usually, I'll just say compliance. There are different styles. You'll sit on this quadrant. There's a circle split into four, and certain answers that you give to these to this particular psychometric exam will show that you sit in a particular quadrant there. Once upon a time, I sat in the S, which is a very supportive way. So it tends to be a lot of admin assistants, a lot of people in support roles where they help people, carers, for instance, sit very strongly in an S. But over the years, I've drifted into the I as I've moved into be more of an influencer type of person. Doesn't make me an influencer like a hashtag Instagram kind of influencer. It just means that I'm the kind of person who tends to step out now and encourage people to follow me in some way, shape, or form. As you can see, I'm on a webinar right now. That's probably the greatest expression of that particular part of the DISC profile. But when you have a workplace, or when you have a group of friends, or if you're marketing towards everybody who just sits squarely in the S sector of a DISC profile, then you have this unfortunate side effect that you're only having that one kind of person, that very supportive person. There's no great leaders, people who are very compliant and very much wanting to make sure that everything is done correctly. You don't have that person in place who's out there leading the sales force. You just have a lot of workers doing a lot of worker stuff, which is fine. If you're a small enough business, there's only one or two of you, or even just the one of you, you may not want another leader. You may not want another salesperson. You may not want another hyper compliant person. You just may want someone supporting you. Hey, I need you to do this. And they go, yep, no problem, I'll do that. But no business can be built on one personality type. In the psychometric evaluations of a DISC profile, then you don't want someone who's just sitting in the middle of one of those things. Or if you're building a team, you don't want your whole team to be sitting in just one type. So for diversity, psychometrics is certainly an area. So is cultural expression. And cultural expression can come out in that some people have different holidays at different times. Because not everybody is a Christian doesn't mean that everybody follows Christmas. Some people will follow Ramadan, others will follow Chanukah, others will follow different, like the Holy Festival, or others will follow different kinds of festivals at different times. Now, when in a previous business life, I had hired a lot of offshore Philippines workers, I had to bear in mind that they have fiesta days and holidays that are very different to the Australian ones. Now, the hardcore Australian would have come in and just said, well, stuff them, they're working for me, they work my holidays, they work my time. But I looked at that and saw an opportunity to be able to learn something about another culture, but also ensure that these people want to stay working with me. And of course they did, because I gave them those days out. They were different to mine. But then there was times when I'd be on a public holiday and they wouldn't be on that public holiday. So it did balance out in the end, but it just meant that I had to be aware that this was a particular day that my workers in the Philippines will be off, and to just know that in front. Now, it's just like anywhere else. You got to understand that when the school holidays are on, you may have to be home from work a little bit more to be able to, be able to look after kids. Or if it's a pupil-free day at school, you may know that, oh, I'm going to have to arrange childcare for my children because they won't be at school today. It's just making allowances to know that different cultures have different times off, have different priorities, have different ways of expressing who it is and what they are. And they may require to have things like, for instance, being aware that the smell of pork can be highly offensive to some people. But for me, the smell of someone heating up day-old tuna in the office is disgusting. It fills the whole office with the smell. So just understanding that it's not just cultural, sometimes it's just being a polite coworker or a polite entrepreneur. Disability is another area of diversity expression. Quite often what we'll find is that we go, well, it's going to be hard. I've got to make sure I've got ramps. I've got to make sure I've got certain facilities and all that. In the modern world where we're particularly working with those who are working from home, and a lot of disabled workers have found a whole new world of jobs to be able to do because of the work from home move, particularly this year, as so much has changed. Then realizing that because someone speaks a little different to you, that their body movements may be a little different to you, doesn't necessarily discount them as a worker for a particular kind of role in your business. At the same time, including images of those who are not always able-bodied, just here and there in some of your marketing materials can make a drastic impact on a world. Disabled people aren't necessarily poor people. We've got this idea in our heads from the 1950s that the disabled have no money, the disabled are not able to work. In 2020 and 21, that is very, very different. The disabled can work and are working. They're making money. They are entrepreneurs. They are spending money. They are active in this world in every other way that you and I are. To have a stereotype that they're not and just assuming that I don't want to market to people who are disabled, so I won't include them in my marketing material, is making a decision to very deliberately avoid marketing to an area of people who do actually participate in our market and our economy. Now, discrimination by age is very heavily expressed in the workforce, but it's just as heavily expressed in the digital marketing of small businesses. And this could be something so very simple as assuming that everybody knows what a Zoom call is. Now, those who are older may not know that. They may never have been on one in their life, and now we're forcing them to go through that. In some respects, it can be like the closure of a bank branch, where an older person only knows how to go to the bank branch, and the learning process of learning how to use an ATM or using phone or internet banking is a very, very difficult change for them to go through. Now, we're not saying you have to provide an in-person branch of everywhere that you want your business to be, but we're saying just be aware. Like all these ones here, be aware that people exist that are outside of what you look like, what you are, what your age is. In fact, with an aging population in Australia, now more than ever, there's more people who are in a part of our economy where they're buying and they're selling and they're participating in the internet in such a big way that are not the age demographic you normally would think. We've got some pretty shocking statistics coming up in the end that show just how much marketing particularly, and especially with small businesses, is playing to a majority or what they think the majority may be. So playing the majority, how is that working? It's how marketing can perpetuate inequality. It's how the way we express ourselves as small businesses actually can make this a whole lot worse, because we use very, very simple and often free tools like Canva. And I'm going to show you actually this particular presentation I made in Canva, but I'm going to show you how Canva actually helps to perpetuate some of these stereotypes by making it really a lot more difficult for you to find diverse images on basic searches for people. So we'll have a look at that in a sec. So I took a quick scroll through Facebook this morning. I'm a white middle-aged man living in Darwin in Northern Territory. I might be gay, and I'm not really much of a minority in other ways. But my marketing this morning, the first 5 messages that came up as ads for me, all contained white people in them. Now it's what, 1, 2, 3, 4 guys, 1 girl. So what we see there is a lack of diversity in gender being expressed. A lot of that may be to do with the fact that Facebook knows my gender, and I've been targeted specifically with ads to people who would match my gender. The fact that they're all Caucasian is a very telling story. It's saying that ClickUp, Encord, Bazastone Wig, I have no idea what that is, NT Innovation Symposium, and Sabine Tech Audio primarily used people like themselves, because they're all businesses founded by white people. And seeing that these all appear just says, well, that's not bad in itself. It's not saying that there's racism inherent in there. It's not. It's just saying that it was actually easier to be able to go and chat to this white guy who owns a gym, because we know him, we actually go to his gym. It's very simple, it's very quick, and it's very easy, and he understands everything we're saying. And he's a good looking guy, and he'll look great on our screens. He's fit, he's young, he's blonde, he's got a great face. He's going to work really well on our ads. But when I then went a little further and looked at a local events company in Darwin called Belong Events, it puts a very, very strong message across in all of its images by saying you don't belong unless you fit this: young, slim, and white. There's only one person in all these photos who isn't actually white. This is probably an extreme example of exclusivity. It's saying this particular events company likes to run events that they call classy. We run very classy events. Well, the undercurrent of that is we run events for beautiful people who all look the same, all act the same, and by and large under the age of 30. Now, is there anything wrong with that business? No, not at all. In fact, I know the people who run it. They are lovely people, but this is exactly what they're trying to get. They're trying to get a particular kind of people in there. So they will advertise and promote everything that fits that particular brand. Their brand values are young, fun, fit, energetic, beautiful, and that certainly have done that. Where it maybe falls down is it assumes that people, that beauty means one thing, and it by and large means Caucasian, slim, fit, and young. I certainly don't belong at a Belong event. But you may say, well, this is my target customer. And I know Belong would probably say that. This is my target customer. The target customer isn't your only customer, though. There's plenty of other people with lots of money who may like to go to an event like this, but the minute they look at those photos, they say, that event's not for me. I won't be going. In fact, I will not go to that event. And I'm now building a vendetta against them. Now, I'm not personally, I'm feeling quite ambivalent about it. I just know that there's no way with my income that I'll ever go to one of their events and spend some of that income on their events, because I don't fit in with what I'm seeing on camera. You might ask, well, I know my customer and this is who they are. When you've finally exhausted the number of people in your usual segment of customers, you need to then start to have a look at what else there is, because people aren't limitless. Unless you're advertising to the whole world or even the whole of Australia, you're going to run out of perfect target customers very quickly. Anyone who's advertised on Facebook and have found that they're trying to find someone who's very, very tightly targeted to a specific niche, specific personality type, a specific background, finds they run out of people really quickly. In a place like Darwin, Cairns, Mackay, Toowoomba, Dubbo, Ballarat, Mandurah, Geraldton, Albany, Esperance, Bunbury, all these places have a limited population. So that when you're trying to get really, really niche down, you realize you have to actually stretch it out a bit and include others in your advertising who may not be as specifically perfectly targeted, but they're kind of adjacent on either side of your target. And you also might also say, and rightly, this is a business and I'm not an activist. That's, no one's telling you that you have to lose money or that you have to make wholesale changes to your business in order to be more inclusive and to embrace some degree of diversity in what you're doing. And that's certainly not what I'd say to that events company. They don't necessarily have to lock, stock and barrel change everything and only show pictures of Indigenous Australians in their images. I'm just saying that there is a way to find money that's beyond your regular target. And that's actually very good for business, because when you run out of those people, when the people who go to your events get a little too old and they put on a couple of kilos and they know that these events are things that they don't really fit into anymore, they stop going and they drop out, and you then need to get another lot of people, and you're always looking for new people to replace it, because we get old, we get fat, most of us, a lot of us, and we change. So we may not fit into that anymore. So having a strategy that allows people to grow in and grow out of your product, but also to feel like they can fit into it because they once upon a time may have seen something that says, oh yes, that is for me, then that's good for business. So other ways you can make inclusivity in your marketing specifically really work for you is by using images with people. Over on the left, we've got a photo of 3 white girls enjoying a coffee and some juice outside, laughing with their very big teeth and their very long hair, and they're gorgeous, beautiful, beautiful people. On the right, we've got equally beautiful people, but just a little bit more diversity in gender, in skin tone, and in the look of them all. They don't all look the same. They're still young, they're still gorgeous, but there's just a little more diversity to the image. Now, these were both taken from Canva. All I had to do was look for cafe, and this is what I found. I could choose the photo where everybody looks the same, or I could choose the photo where there is at least a little bit of diversity in the people there. This way, I'm not leaving anyone out really, because someone with darker skin, an African American or an Aboriginal, I'm going to say there's someone there with skin that's kind of like mine. Images with flags are an interesting one because we're proud of our country and we love our country. But sometimes showing the flag in that sort of way doesn't feel like it represents all of us. And I'm talking specifically about some Indigenous Australians, talking about some migrants that don't necessarily think that flag really says much to them. So you do have the choice when you go into these things to go, well, I can choose the one on the right, which is very bold and looks really cool and very patriotic, or I can choose the one on the left, which says the same thing. It's a map of Australia with a pin and a flag in it, but it's not it's saying the word Australia, it's showing the actual shape of Australia, it's showing the places around Australia. It's giving the same message, but it's not just immediately saying bogans with Southern Cross tattoos and utes, which is quite often what you'll see that thought come back. And I go, well, I don't fit into that. So therefore, this particular piece of marketing, this particular website, it just doesn't really suit me that well. I don't feel comfortable with it. It doesn't represent me. Another area to be very, very careful with is cultural appropriation. There's a story of a particular committee I'm on in the Northern Territory for a particular business group. That business group produced certificates of membership, which had a very similar pattern to the Aboriginal print, the dot print on the right. Now, the dot print like that is very, very representative of Central Australian Aboriginal art. Doesn't represent Northern Australian or most of Australian Aboriginal art. This is a very specific style of painting. Yet this was the style of painting that was appropriated and put onto a certificate for a non-Aboriginal organisation. When I raised it with them, there was the thought of, oh, you're overthinking it, And I thought, well, actually, no, this is actually stealing someone's art and using it outside of the context of that person who produced that art, number one, without permission, and number two, in a really distasteful way. It's saying that we're happy to use your art, but we're not going to recognize who the artist was. We're happy to use your art as a decoration on a certificate, but not credit back whose work that actually was. And in that specific example, putting Aboriginal art on that specific certificate actually was totally inappropriate, simply because we were not pretending to be an Aboriginal organisation. We're not an Aboriginal organisation. And there's 50,000 other variations of things we could have put on that certificate to add some colour and some style to it. Things like photos of the landscape, things like photos of people, including the Northern Territory flag or something very similar to that. So thankfully, we talked around it and realised actually that's probably not cool that we did that. We can probably do something else. But it's not just Aboriginal art. It could be art from the Māori of New Zealand. It could be art that's taken from specific peoples of other places. Probably an example could be a lot of tribal tattoos that are produced by probably a lot of middle-aged men who go to Bali and get tribal tattoos, appropriating imagery from the Pacific Islands, from Asian cultures, and making it about them. Whilst that's not necessarily illegal, and it's definitely not illegal, it can be very distasteful in that you're taking someone else's culture and turning it into your tattoo. Whilst it may look pretty, it may be something you need to look at in your marketing to go, is this necessarily where I want to go? Is this a message I want to send out, that I routinely take cultural cues from others and don't recognize that those cues are from others? I just assume them as mine. You can also recognize when there's an algorithm, and most of us are probably using Canva for our graphics. I know I use it probably much more than I use even Photoshop, but recognizing when the algorithms for search do have a bit of a bias. On the left, the handsome man I put in for a search in Canva's photos section, and handsome man came up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, at least 12 images of Caucasian men before it brought up anybody else from another background. Now there's different variations of tans there, but these are clearly handsome Caucasian men. The same thing happened on the right when it came to women. I looked for beautiful woman, and up came 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The first 12 images were all of Caucasian women with fair skin. So recognizing that quite often when we're looking at things like this, we're looking for a photo of a handsome man to be, you know, the model on our piece of graphic that we're putting on from Canva to our Facebook profile or to Instagram, is recognizing that what the algorithm says is necessarily handsome or beautiful isn't necessarily inclusive or diverse. Quite often it's the opposite. In this case, Canva gets this really, really wrong. And it gets it wrong in a lot of areas like this when you search for, but it gets it right in some areas too. I searched for Australian, and when I searched for the word Australian, the second photo came up of a young Asian girl holding the Australian flag. So it has images and moments where it's particularly diverse, but you just got to be aware that there's sometimes is a bit of a bias there in algorithms based upon who the people are who are using Canva and what your own search history may be. I'm not saying that you have to use photos of diverse people in all of your marketing material. That's not the message. we're saying is just recognize that there is a bias there. Stop and think for a second and go, I have a chance here to use someone else, or do I just use the same as what I've used on everything else that I've ever produced? You can also recognize gender stereotyping when it comes up. Cleaning products, household chores, all that sort of thing is very strongly geared towards women. Now, Canva got this one a little bit better. In fact, the third photo that came up in the search for, housework, actually had a guy with the kids. And represented throughout the photos, the first 12 I saw, 3 of those photos did have men performing the housework, which is probably appropriate, I guess, when it comes to what we know, the contribution of men to household chores. But again, a thing to recognize that the number of photos and the algorithm have a bias towards putting women in these roles, not men, or not showing at least men and women working together on it. It's always showing one person working on their own, perhaps with the kids, and then showing women performing that housework. Now, again, doesn't mean that if you're a cleaner that you only use photos of men doing cleaning. It's just being aware that there are stereotypes and there are biases that are reflected on the algorithms when you deal with these kind of platforms. I would say though, if you're in doubt and you're not really sure the message you want to put across, then you may let's leave the people out. If in doubt, leave the people out and just have photos. And these are all Canva photos as well. So if you're talking about your cleaning business, you don't necessarily have to show pictures of people doing the cleaning if you don't have photos of yourself doing the cleaning, for example. If in doubt, leave the people out and show a diversity of images showing, what cleaning could be like. But you do not have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I repeated this a number of times. It doesn't mean that every time you produce an image that you have to produce an image that has diverse people in it or people of different shapes and sizes. But what I would say is just think, as you're approaching doing your next presentation, as you're approaching doing your next piece of advertising, as you're approaching doing your next Instagram profile post, just remember that if you're producing graphics of photos of people who aren't like you, you're also opening up to affecting other people outside of there. So showing people that if you're black, you fit in. If you're white, you fit in. If you're Asian, you fit in. If you're Indian, you fit in. If you're Aboriginal, you fit in as well. And all of these people are represented in Canva's photo library. You can find them very, very easily. Recognizing that people come from different backgrounds and recognizing that there is room for all sorts of expression of life in your marketing and in your small business communications means that you're opening up to a far wider range of customers, not just customers who are 35, men and women who are white, who always grew up in Australia, they speak English, they drink and eat the same thing as everybody else does. When you open up your marketing to a broader variety of people, you're opening up your market to a broader variety of people. And when the tastes change in trends, you'll find that you're far more protected and buffered from those changes when your customer set is far more diverse. Trends don't always make it through to every cultural expression or to every gender expression or to every sexual orientation. Sometimes trends are slower or even faster to move in and out. So if suddenly your product becomes not so trendy anymore, there could be a whole subset of people that aren't the majority that will still actually find your product utterly useful and utterly fascinating. But you wouldn't know that unless you open up your marketing to include them as well. And finally, as we move into the idea of diversity in communication, there's 3 really simple steps that I come up with that helps you to communicate better with people from very diverse backgrounds. The first being simple language that's delivered as clearly as possible without needing extra interpretation. I was using a word before, which was a big word. It was a word that could have been used by 3 or 4 other smaller words instead. But I chose what I call the wank word. I chose the word which is a lot easier for me to think of because I'm highly educated. But for those who aren't so highly educated, they will switch off as soon as they don't know it. The author L. Ron Hubbard, who wrote the Dianetics book, the founder of Scientology, one of the few things he said that made sense to me was that if people read a book or read some marketing material and they see a word they don't understand, they get stuck there and they don't learn anything after that word because their brain is still stuck on that word that they didn't understand. But if you can get them to understand what you're writing, then they understand the next paragraph they're reading. And if they understand that, then they can move on to the next and keep understanding because they don't have to seek interpretation every time. Sometimes I read articles from journalists and I really have to go and look up the the definition of that particular word they used. Magazines like the Harvard Business Review, newspapers like the Australian or the Sydney Morning Herald can sometimes get a little bit up themselves by using language that really requires you to think about what the definition of that word is. Not all of us have journalism degrees and don't understand the power of a very wide vocabulary. Some of us just get on by with the English that we have. So if we can deliver our language as simply as possible, then it's clear to more people. And it doesn't need that stop-start of stop-start. Your message can flow nicely from start to end rather than requiring interpretation along the way. Another set of ideas is how to present your text on a page. Now, this can be really, really important. Throughout this presentation, I've actually gone very wrong. I've done a lot of center aligning. I've done a lot of all capitals writing because it looks nice. It looks better. Graphically, it looks neater and tidier and more interesting. But when I add things like dot points, when I use upper and lower case interchangeably, when I left align all my writing, our brain, having trained in a Western way of thinking, of reading, of writing, tends to read things a lot more easily. Now, there's only a few areas of the world where right to left language is used. For instance, Chinese is written in right to left, not left to right. Arabic is right to left. And so is Hebrew. The script of Israel is written from right to left. But the vast majority of languages are written from left to right. And so people from those particular areas, the brain is geared in such a way that left to right makes sense. Now, you don't make your writing more diverse by suddenly switching it to right to left or going to the center line. In this case, you do play for the majority because when you're thinking about somebody who comes, say, from China and they're used to reading things from right to left, in their education of English, reading and writing, they switched to left to right. They don't just turn it upside down and suddenly read English backwards. They know that when they're reading our particular Roman characters, that you need to read from left to right in this particular case. So when you're delivering an English language or any of the Romanesque languages or any languages that aren't really Chinese or Japanese or Hebrew or Arabic, then always deliver it in left to right because it makes so much more sense and it's easier for the eye to follow. All the friction's taken away from it. You're not making people start and stop and think as they're reading. You want that information to flow nicely and to be able to get into them very, very easily. And then the other way with your communication is a very old principle that actually comes from a biblical verse. I know I said in the religion section before that referring to Bible verses is probably, can be very, very fraught with danger because you could be talking about an idea or a phrase or a psalm that nobody outside of that particular religious background would understand. But this one does come from a religious background. It comes from let your yes be yes and your no be no, which is simply saying, I think it was in Paul's letter to the Corinthians or the Philippians or one of those ones in the New Testament of the Bible. And it was saying let your yes be yes and your no be no is saying that if you're going to say yes to something, say yes. You don't have to find a flowery way around it. Be clear what you're saying. Colloquialisms are the enemy of this. A lot of that, what they call rhyming slang in Australia, where you're talking about, oh, just put a bit of dead horse on it, which is a way of saying put a bit of tomato sauce on my pie. Could be something which is absolutely horrific to someone who doesn't understand what rhyming slang is. It's a very cultural thing within Australia and Britain particularly, a little bit in New Zealand as well. We're saying you're off down the frog and toad, which means you're off down the road. Those sort of things take away from the clarity. Yes, they add a lot of personality to your marketing and add a lot of personality to your writing, but you've got to remember that people who understand these references may not be even the majority of people who are reading what you're writing. It may be so obscure. I've made references to movies before in conversations and people have not known what I'm talking about. So understand that there is a context to which your communication reaches lots of different people. If you're writing to your dad, the frog and toad is perfectly valid because he may understand what you're saying. But writing to your marketing and talking about the frog and toad and a bit of dead horse and, you know, I'm off to see the old ball and chain, or the trouble and strife, or I'm off to see my skin and blister, which is your sister. That sort of stuff is just going to confuse people. You want the information you're delivering to be delivered smoothly and easily and with a flow towards people, not making them having to stop and look at that sentence and go, I don't know what that means, and then not be able to move on. Because ultimately, your marketing communications is all going to be around the ability for people to understand you and then act on that information. If they can't get past your colloquialisms, then they're not going to get to that book now, read now, buy now, learn more button, because quite frankly, they've already lost confidence in you as a communicator. So they're probably going to lose confidence in you as a business owner as well. Here's a bit of diversity in statistic and how Australia stacks up. There's not that many of them, only about 3, and I'll show you them. They're kind of shocking, but kind of obvious as well. 72% of Australians speak only English at home, but 38% don't speak only English at home. If you're in such a position, you can completely discount 38% of the Australian population for your marketing. You must be doing fantastic. But I'd say if you're like me, you're a smaller business, you're still trying to grow your business, then that 38% could be the difference between you paying your bills next week and not paying your bills next week. You're leaving money on the table when you only go for one set of people. 28% of Australians are between the ages of 25 and 44 years old, yet 62% of all advertising is aimed at them. So this is sort of age discrimination almost playing out in the advertising world. Advertising is geared towards what they call the washing machine ages. It's usually women between 25 and 45. That's where they say women buy washing machines. It's a really sexist old Mad Men, Madison Avenue kind of David Ogilvy approach to advertising segmentation, which is just basically breaking people up into groups and saying this group is the best group to send it to. Let's advertise and appeal only to them. Yet only 28% of Australians are between that age group. Yet 62%, the vast majority of all advertising is geared to them. But this one will get you even more between the eyes. 72% of all marketing is actually aimed squarely and solely just at women. 72% of all marketing advertising, yet only 38% of wealth in Australia is held by women. It's saying that that 38% holding of wealth is expected to spend all the money to buy the stuff that 72% of the advertising and marketing is geared towards. There's something certainly amiss when it comes to our world, when it comes to marketing and advertising. And this includes not just all the big brands. They're actually getting a lot better at their diversity because they've kind of had to. But in small business, we go for the easiest path forward, the path of least resistance, which usually is, I want to do business with people just like me. It's easier. I know how to communicate with them. We have the similar cultural background. We have the similar cultural experiences. We speak the same language. And when I make references to things, they understand what they are. It's easy. It flows. Yet not everyone in the world is like you or I. They don't look like us. They don't necessarily talk like us. They may not have the same beliefs and the same background as us. They've got money too. So by not appealing somehow to people outside of what you and I look like, we're leaving a lot of money to rot on the table. And that's just simply really bad for business. Diversity and inclusion are just good for business, but it does take a little bit of thought before you post that image on Facebook or record that podcast or start that live video. Understand that not everybody reads and writes things the same way as you do, and you'll go a long way to including diversity and inclusion in your particular business. If you'd like to talk more about this at any stage, you can book an ASBAS Digital Solutions one-to-one appointment with me. You just look for ASBAS Treaty as a particular consultant, and they can direct you towards me. Or if you just want me to set it up for you, it's $44 for your first one, $66 for any follow-ups. And you can get through to me via Dante at treaty.com.au or through any of those channels there, whether it's my website, my Facebook page or my LinkedIn page as well. I look forward to having a chat with you. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I certainly hope that you can move forward with a bit of courage and understand that diversity and inclusion isn't about quotas. It isn't about forcing things. It isn't about preaching. It's not about being a wild lefty. It's just simply taking a little thought before you post that image on Facebook, taking a little bit of thought before you do that graphic in Canva, taking a little thought as you write that post on LinkedIn, ensuring that it's easy to understand and open to anybody be able to get some great value out of it. I thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you have a fantastic week and get some diversity and a bit of inclusion in your business as well. Good afternoon.